Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. I have really enjoyed my time here all day yesterday, and I appreciate seeing you all again this morning. I've been asked to dig a little deeper into gender ideology, into transgenderism. We touched on it yesterday. Yesterday I showed how it fit into the overarching worldview that also affects abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, and transgenderism. But today I've been asked to dip even more deeply into transgenderism because that's the issue that seems to be the most pressing issue of our day. So let's look for a moment at just a graph of what we're up against. These graphs show the rates of increase in the number of young people who are transitioning in 4 different countries: the US, Britain, Australia, and Sweden. And you'll see some graphs have 2 lines, and the top line represents girls. Notice how it shoots up way past boys. So this is primarily an issue that's affecting young girls. Now, what exactly is gender ideology? As we saw yesterday, it is a split between the mind and the body, or the mind or the feelings and the body. Let me give you some examples. NPR, which is National Public Radio, went to several schools and interviewed students. And they reported, "We encountered high school students who said, 'I reject the gender binary, that is the male-female binary, as an oppressive move by the dominant culture.'" So biology is now a form of oppression. The same program went on to say, at one college, things were so fluid you could make up a different pronoun for a different event. In other words, you maybe go to class as a male and later that night go out as a female. So if gender has nothing to do with biology, it can change. In Australia, there was a girl who said, as she prepared for the prom, they bought a suit and a dress because they did not know what identity the girl would be that night. At medical schools, students are policing professors' speech. They are reporting the professors as transphobic and forcing them to apologize if they use words like male and female or pregnant woman instead of pregnant person. The same gender ideology reaches all the way down to 1st grade. In Chicago schools, 1st graders are taught, whatever pronouns you pick today, you can always change. And by 3rd grade, kids are taught to break the gender binary established by white colonizers with their Western and Christian ideological framework. And this cartoon, I'll bet some of you have seen this one before, because it's ubiquitous. It is everywhere. It's widely used in schools to deconstruct sexuality into 5 separate factors: sex assigned at birth, gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. And you can literally find young people on places like Twitter and TikTok agonizing over discovering their different expressions. They'll say, I'm physically attracted to girls, but I'm emotionally attracted to boys, or whatever. They're trying to figure out all these different components. And what this cartoon is teaching young people, of course, is that there is no unified self, that you are a disconnected, discordant patchwork of mix and match parts that can all be contradictory. In fact, did you see the text at the bottom? This is from the website where I found this gender unicorn. It's the organization that created this image. And it literally says that the term biological sex is harmful to trans people. It's sometimes called, biological sex is sometimes called hate speech. And you must see Blue's Clues. Did some of your children grow up on Blue's Clues? When I show this to my students, they all go, "Oh," because they were raised on Blue's Clues. And so during Gay Pride Month, the program essentially told children that biology gives no clues to their identity. And the trend is even reaching down to newborns. You all have heard of gender-neutral parenting, right? And there's a Facebook page for these parents, and it says point blank, there is no such thing as biological sex. Sure, it says people have bodies, chromosomes, and genitals, but calling this sex is a social construction rather than a biological fact. This is serious biology denial. And where is it coming from? Well, it's filtering down, obviously, from the universities, from gender studies programs on college campuses, where postmodern thinkers are saying their goal is to denaturalize gender. That means to cut it off from any grounding in nature. And so we can use the diagram that we introduced yesterday, where gender ideology represents a radically divided, fractured, fragmented view of what it means to be a human being. Right? So your biological identity is obviously based on science, but your gender identity has nothing to do with your biological identity. So where did this all start from? Recall yesterday I started by explaining the split view of truth, that traditionally most cultures have a unified view of truth, right? They know that there's a natural order and a moral, spiritual order, but they do believe that they're connected, that they're interrelated, so that there is a single unified cosmos. But with the rise of modern science, many people began to say, no, the only reliable form of knowledge we have is science, what you can hear, see, weigh, and measure. Empirically testable facts. Well, what does that imply for moral and spiritual truths? You cannot directly test them empirically, right? They cannot be stuffed into a test tube or studied under a microscope. And so many people began to say that moral and spiritual truths do not really qualify as truths. They're not truth. They're merely a matter of personal feelings and preferences. And so the concept of truth has been divided into two separate domains. And this is we went over this in my first lecture yesterday, because this is sometimes called the fact-value split. And it's the theme of my book, Total Truth. And by the way, I found out, I didn't know until yesterday that book has been translated into German. It's which is great. Die ganze Wahrheit, weißt? So it's out there on the book table. So I'm delighted to find out it's available in German. I knew Liebe deinen Körper was, but I didn't know Die ganze Wahrheit ist auf Deutsch as well. So let's go through some key turning points in history where the concept of truth led to, the divided concept of truth led to a divided concept of the human being. So the first the person who's often considered the first philosopher of the modern age is Descartes, René Descartes, who proposed a very sharp mind-body dualism. So Descartes said, the body is part of nature. And so it's mechanical, it's determined by the laws of nature. Nature is a big machine, and our bodies are little machines that are part of nature. But the mind, he said, is free and autonomous. And therefore, the mind can discover the laws of nature and control it, a little like the way we control a machine. In fact, he said his goal was to make humans the masters and possessors of nature, as you see on the top of the slide. One philosopher explains it this way. Since Descartes in the 17th century, we have had a vision of the self as a sort of immaterial ghost who owns and controls the body the way you own and control your car. So the Cartesian view has been mocked as the ghost in the machine. But do you see how it is already setting the stage for transgenderism? the idea that the mind is separate from the body and in a sense controls and owns and controls the body for its own purposes. A former lesbian puts it this way: the body has been reduced to a wet machine. It's a tool that you can use for whatever purpose suits your fancy. Our culture is pressuring us to accept the idea that your body is not you. It is just a shell, a juicy robot that the real you, which is the disembodied ghost, controls. So this is the Cartesian legacy. And the Cartesian is just the adjective for what comes from Descartes. The next important turning point was the philosopher Immanuel Kant in the next century, the 18th century. He went so far as to say humans are not actually capable of knowing any objective order in nature. The human mind creates the objects that we think that we find in nature. In fact, his actual words were, "Objects have no independent existence outside our thoughts. And therefore, the mind is the lawgiver to nature." So the human mind takes the place of God in giving structure to the world. And so do you see how this takes us one step closer to transgender ideology? We do not take our identity from nature, from our bodies. Instead, the mind imposes an identity onto the body. It is a mental construction. These ideas would not really have taken root, though, without the impact of Darwinism in the next century, the 19th century. The key elements in Darwin's theory, random mutations and the blind automatic process of natural selection, was specifically intended to eliminate the concept of design and purpose in nature. So Jacques Barzun, who is an intellectual historian, says, this denial of purpose is Darwin's distinctive contention. In other words, other versions of evolution allowed for some form of divine direction, but Darwin did not. In fact, another historian puts it this way: where most men and women generally believed in some kind of design in nature, some kind of plan or order, Darwin wanted to see all life as empty of any divine purpose. A recent New Yorker article put it like this: the loyalty oath of modernity, isn't that a grand phrase? You know, the loyalty oath that you must take if you want to be considered a modern person, is that nature is without conscious design, that the emergence of Homo sapiens was without meaning or telos. Do you know what telos is? So that's the Greek word for goal or purpose, or teleology, the technical term is. And here's Richard Dawkins with his very colorful language. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So in an earlier age, nature was regarded as God's creation, and it was imbued with God's purposes. But Darwin seemed to offer a completely materialistic view of nature as a machine with no intrinsic purpose. Look how one philosopher puts it. This is not a Christian philosopher, by the way, but he really understands the issue. When nature was seen as a manifestation of God's will, then the goal of knowledge was to fulfill God's design and to live in harmony with his purposes. But, he goes on, if nature does not reveal God's will, then it is a morally neutral realm where humans are free to impose their will, so that nature becomes merely raw material to be manipulated and controlled to serve human needs and preferences. So, nature becomes a mechanistic system of extended matter without religious or moral significance. And our knowledge of this disenchanted world no longer supports either morality or religion. And here's a Christian thinker who says essentially the same thing. He says, as Western culture lost belief in the spiritual and ethical significance of creation and of the human body, these became essentially amoral mechanisms to be used to whatever private ends or purposes that we happen to have. So what I want you to get from all of this is there is a causal connection. It's because of a modernist view of nature and the body as amoral mechanisms that people became most postmodern in their view of gender. Do you see that? It was a view of science that came first, that nature is amoral, that we cannot get any idea of the good from nature. And as a result, people became postmodern. In other words, if you have to use that split view of truth again, the fact-value split, if you are a modernist, if you're in your view of nature, you will be postmodern in your view of the human body or of gender or human identity. In fact, let's revisit a quote that I gave yesterday. It's from Camille Paglia, who's a well-known public intellectual, and it captures the logic so clearly that I want to repeat it. Do you remember she's the one who said, she's kind of an iconoclastic feminist because she does not believe that sex is a social construction. She says, no, nature made us male and female. Our sexual bodies are designed for reproduction. Designed, did you catch that word? A strange word for an atheist to say. By the way, she calls herself a pagan, not an atheist. She's a pagan. But if nature made us male and female, how does she justify? So for many years, she's been well known as a lesbian. About 2 years ago, she came out as transgender. She was always a butch lesbian, in other words, a more masculine lesbian. And so when transgenderism became a thing, she now identifies as transgender. She hasn't changed her appearance at all. She looks the same. She hasn't, she doesn't dress like a man, or she hasn't changed anything. But I've seen her many times in public saying that she's now transgender. But the point is, whether lesbian or transgender, if nature made us male and female, how does she justify that? And here are her words again. Well, why not defy nature? After all, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So I wanted to repeat this from yesterday because I want you to catch the logic of it. If our bodies are products of mindless, material, purposeless forces, then our bodies have no intrinsic purpose that we are morally obligated to respect. And we may do with them as we see fit. A Princeton professor wrote what I think is the first book defending transgenderism. And of course, I have to read what the academics say, because what the academics say is what filters down to ordinary people eventually. And here's what she says. She starts out, to my surprise, by admitting that transgenderism involves disconnect, disjunction, self-division, self-estrangement, self-alienation. In other words, your feelings, your mind and feelings are disconnected from your body. But then she says, that doesn't really matter, because what the real body, that is the physical body, tells us is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So this is at the heart of what schools are teaching young people today, that their bodies have no meaning at all. The body is just a brute material fact, and we decide what meaning to give it. This is devastating because our bodies are they're an important part of who we are. So if our bodies have no meaning, then do we really have any meaning? These ideas are filtering down into the church. A few years ago, the magazine Christianity Today interviewed a female United Methodist minister who underwent a sex change operation to present as a male. And what was her explanation? She said, my body was born female. Oh, wait, did I have two of those? Anyway, here we are. My body was born female, but my body didn't match what I am. So what's she saying? She's saying my body is not part of what I am, right? She did not regard her body as part of her authentic self. But if gender has nothing to do with biology, what is it based on? Well, actually, no one knows. There was a former evangelical named Virginia Mollenkott. I don't know if some of you may know her because she was one of the early evangelical feminists. So yeah, I knew her. I read her stuff. But now she's written a book called Omnigender. Omni, like omnivore, right? It means all genders. Arguing that all sexual identities are now up for grabs. And a review of the book appeared in a theological journal. And it said, arguments against women's ordination now need wholesale revamping since we do not know for sure what a woman is. This was long before a Supreme Court, a United States Supreme Court nominee famously said she could not say what a woman is. You all remember that, right? She was asked point blank, can you say what a woman is? And she said no. So what this theological journal said years ago is now part of the public discourse. When I talk to people on these issues, the argument I have found surprisingly effective is based on environmentalism. And you say, what's the connection between environmentalism and gender identity? Well, one thing that we have learned from the environmental movement is that if you want to avoid pollution and environmental, ecological disasters, we need to respect the structure of nature. It doesn't mean we can't intervene, but when we do intervene, we need to work with the natural order, not against it. We may not do as we see fit, to use Camille Paglia's words, when it comes to the environment. And in the same way, what Christians are arguing is that we should respect the structure of our own biological nature. That the biological correspondence between male and female is not some evolutionary accident. It's part of the original design that God pronounced very good. We can understand a movement better when we know what its end game is. So what's the end game of transgenderism? Its ultimate goal is transhumanism. Transhumanism is the idea that humans are just one stage in an endless process of evolution. So why not use biotechnology, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence to create the next stage of evolution? Why not defy nature, as Camille Paglia put it, to the point of creating something beyond humanity? As one writer puts it, social engineering rests on a philosophy that is materialist and mechanistic. It represents the world as nothing but manipulable matter. Let me give you a quote from somebody who supports transhumanism. This is the creator of Sirius XM satellite radio. So he is a billionaire. It is a man who identifies as a woman. He used to be Martin, now he's Martine. By the way, he didn't transition until he'd already married and had three children. So he fathered 3 children, but now he's a woman. And he says explicitly that transgenderism is a stepping stone to transhumanism. Here's how he puts it. People who refuse to be labeled as male or female are the pioneers of seeing humanity as not being limited by any particular substrate, such as flesh. He goes on to say, humanness is in the mind, and thus a human need not have a flesh body. There is a queer line of development from transgender to transhuman. Martin Rothblatt even says, we must overcome the sin of fleshism. Do you see the title of the slide? Fleshism. That's defined as an immoral preference for flesh, just as racism is an immoral preference for one race, or sexism is a preference for one sex. You should not prefer flesh as a substrate for being human. In fact, what he's saying here is that holding a high view of the flesh and blood body is wrong and even immoral. A professor emeritus of Princeton University says, since nature has no telos, remember that means no purpose, no goal, no teleology, the human species is at its greatest when it breaks out of nature. If nature has no intrinsic purpose, then why not break free from nature and do whatever you want with it? And here's the Google's director of engineering, Ray Kurzweil. He says the whole idea of a species, he means a human species, is a biological concept. And what we're doing is transcending biology. Notice none of these people are fringe people. They are people with influence, money, and influence. The underlying worldview here is the idea that the body is not integral to the self. It's merely raw material out of which we create something radically novel, even transcendent, that is transcendent to biology. Transhumanists promise that they are going to usher in a utopia. Here's what one transhumanist says: we will no longer be slaves to our genes. We will take charge over our genetic programming and achieve mastery over our biology and our neurological processes. We will seek complete choice over bodily form and function. Do you see how they're saying that this is the next step to transgenderism? If you can change your bodily form and function, your sexual organs, why not other things? Some people have taken to calling this scientific Gnosticism. Recall, I talked about this yesterday, that the early Christians faced Gnosticism. That was one of the ideologies, one of the philosophies that opposed Christianity in the early church. And Gnosticism was a philosophy that despised and devalued the physical world, including the body. They called the body the prison of the soul. So you had this divine spark within you, but it was trapped in a prison of a material body. And the goal of salvation was to escape that prison, escape the body. The difference is that modern Gnosticism is scientific, which is why it's sometimes called scientific Gnosticism, because it promises to use the latest scientific knowledge and scientific techniques to liberate us from the constraints of the body. And the ultimate goal, we are told, is to turn humans into gods. Here's how one artificial intelligence researcher writes. Current evidence suggests that it will be possible to create transhuman minds in effect, to build gods. It may be possible to become gods. Lowercase g, but still gods. Of course, the only people who will be elevated to the status of divinity are the elites, not us ordinary people. An advisor to the World Economic Forum is the best-selling author, Yuval Harari. Yuval Harari, he's kind of their resident intellectual of the WEF. And he says that these technological advances are going to create growing mobs of economically useless people. So there will be the gods, and then there will be these economically useless people. In fact, he writes, the biggest question maybe in economics and politics in the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. They're basically meaningless, worthless. So that's how they see us. So these so-called useless people will become a new class of serfs, subject to a totalitarian rule by the quote-unquote gods. And how will these gods treat this new class of serfs, these worthless, useless people? Well, this is a bit of a long quote, but it's very important. It really captures the point. If we perceive ourselves and others to be disembodied minds piloting meat machines, bodies of mere matter that do not matter, what horror will we be capable of inflicting on the bodies of others? When we renounce our humanity, we forget what it means to inflict pain and to suffer. So if a totalitarian government sees you and me as meat machines, by the way, that's Richard Dawkins' favorite phrase, right? That we are merely meat machines. If bodies do not matter, what kind of cruelty and injustice will become possible? So, as Christians, our response needs to be to recover the biblical view of the value and goodness of creation. Matter does matter. C.S. Lewis has a clever little quote. He says, Christians, he says, try to be more spiritual than God. They sometimes think that we should disregard the material world, the physical world, and live only in the spiritual world. And he says, God likes matter. He invented it. So our goal is, C.S. Lewis, Luther, I quoted him last night, but Luther said if you're fighting the battle on all other fronts except the front that's being attacked, then you're not really in the battle. And Christians need to recognize that there's a battle going on over the value of matter, of our material bodies. That's where the battle is. It's hard for Christians to get their minds around that because we tend to think, it's the materialist, the philosophical materialists who value matter because they say matter is all that exists. You can think that matter is all that exists and still have a low view of matter because you think it has no significance, it has no value. It's just manipulable stuff, for us to make out of it whatever we want. So when I won't name names, but there was a Christian philosopher who reviewed my book, Love Thy Body, and he said, Nancy's mistaken when she says that materialists have a low view of matter, because after all, they think matter is all that exists. And my response is, yeah, but they don't think it matters. Matter does not matter. It has no value, no significance, because it's a product of blind material forces. So it's and my students have asked me this too, by the way. They think, wait a minute, surely the materialists have a high view of matter. They don't. Christians have a much higher view of matter because it's a product of a loving creator who created it intentionally for a purpose. So we do not advance, we do not progress by leaving matter behind, by transcending our physical bodies, as transhumanism says. Our bodies reflect God's purpose just as much as our minds and spirits do. Even a dyed-in-the-wool atheist like Richard Dawkins acknowledges that nature gives evidence of design and purpose. In the first page of one of his books, he defines biology. And how does he define biology? It's the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So what Christians say is, why not take that evidence at face value? There is a purpose to our biology, and we will build a much more humane society if we honor that purpose and live in harmony with it. Okay, let's come back from the future to our own day and end with some practical steps. I'm going to repeat from last night this slide. And the reason is that when I speak at Christian colleges, Christian seminaries, Christian schools, conferences, whatever, I find that this is the hardest thing for Christians to get their mind around. That we need to use positive language. honor your body, respect your biological identity, live in tune with your body, live in harmony with the Creator's design. Because Christians often want to start with a message of sin, right? The classic revivalist message is you're a sinner, you need to get saved. And that is true. But if you lead with that message, it creates the mistaken notion that Christianity sees people as inherently broken, evil, and corrupt. But the Christian message, and by the way, I've had students who grew up with that message, and they will come and tell me, in the church I grew up with, the message was, that you're worthless, that you're nothing. Before God, you're nothing. And you might say that that's a message that starts with the fall. Have you ever heard the breakdown that Christianity has three basic turning points? Creation, fall, redemption. Well, they're starting with the fall. We need to start with creation. The message is that we're made in God's image and have great value and dignity, and that should be our starting point when we talk to non-Christians. In fact, that's why the fall is such a tragedy, right? If you have a cheap plastic trinket and it breaks, you toss it aside without a second thought. But if a priceless artistic masterpiece is broken, then that is a catastrophe. And the reason the fall is such a tragedy is that we are God's priceless masterpieces. And so we need to approach people with the message that their life has dignity and meaning because it is the handiwork of the Creator. Francis Schaeffer used to talk about this all the time. He says the Christian message does not start with the fall. The Christian message starts with creation. And so our message starts with the high value and dignity we have as made in the image of God. The next step is to be proactive. You might remember this from last night as well, because I talked about how both gender dysphoria and same-sex behavior is most strongly correlated with gender non-conforming behavior in childhood, far stronger than any genetic correlate. And so I'm going to give you another quote from the academic literature. Children who grow up to be non-heterosexual are substantially more gender non-conforming on average than children who grow up to be heterosexual. This is a finding that has been consistently and repeatedly replicated. So the arguments from genetics are very much overridden by simply kids who are gender non-conforming, which means they behave in ways that are more stereotypical of the other sex. And the good news, of course, is that roughly 80 to 90% of these children who experience some form of gender distress lose those feelings before adulthood. And it's usually in puberty because there's that rush of hormones at that stage. A BBC film, it's a very good film, it's called Transgender Kids. It features a young girl named Alex. When she was 2 years old, she told her parents she was a boy. And when they refused to treat her as a boy, they did not change her name, they did not use boy pronouns, she would explode in angry outbursts. She would have terrible temper tantrums. Her father said she would literally scream, "I'm a boy," while clenching her fists and punching herself in the crotch. Her father said raising Alex was like a battle. It was like a war zone. It was not easy. Fortunately, this was before gender therapy for minors had been outlawed. And so the family found a clinic that encouraged Alex to be less rigid in her concept of gender. To consider there are lots of ways to be a girl. You can be a girl who plays with Barbie dolls, or you can be a girl who plays softball. And in fact, at age 8, Alex did join a softball team. Actually, this was in Toronto. So what they really said was, you can be a girl who plays hockey. But she did join a softball team. And she says, for the first time, I saw other girls who were maybe even more tomboy than I was. They like to do sporty things, and I had never really come across that before. I think it took a while. I would not have waited till age 8. I would have put my kid in soccer at age 4, whatever. But anyway, at age 8, it took 4 more years to make a complete turnaround, right? So these gender dysphoria is a difficult and deeply rooted issue. It took 4 more years before she recovered her identity as a girl. And she said that's when she was 12, she said that's when I started to accept myself for who I was. A girl who also had boy interest. Although I don't think softball should be considered a boy interest. I think that can be a girl interest. Now, unfortunately, in many places today, it is illegal to work to help a child like Alex to be more in tune with her biology. If you are a licensed therapist, you will lose your license unless you immediately affirm transition. In fact, the clinic in Toronto where Alex got help was later shut down by transgender activists. So it's not working. It's no longer functioning. It is the only medical condition where children are allowed to self-diagnose and adults are not allowed to question. And yet studies show that children with gender distress suffer additional mental health issues. This was the first study ever done. This is Lisa Littman at Brown University. And she was focusing on girls who had shown no gender distress, no gender dysphoria when they were young, right? It appeared for the first time in late adolescence, teenage years. So this is called rapid onset gender dysphoria. In fact, she's the one who coined that term. And because it is a new phenomenon, transsexualism used to, when it was called transsexualism, it usually showed up when children were quite young. And so this is a new thing. And she found that 63% of these girls had been diagnosed with at least one mental health order prior to the onset of their gender dysphoria. So things like anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, self-harm, eating disorders, bipolar, and autism. And by the way, autism is the most commonly connected to gender dysphoria, and people aren't quite sure why. But autism is very common with both boys and girls who have gender dysphoria. And let me emphasize the word diagnosed. Most teens have some anxiety and depression, but these teens had issues that were so severe they'd already been received counseling and been diagnosed. Fortunately, there's also good news. Many young people today are detransitioning. The number of detransitioners is growing very quickly. And they're turning around and accusing the clinics of fast-tracking them into gender treatment without offering psychological help for all of these gender issues that they have. Whoops, it went. It should be on this one still. They're not getting counseling for all of these issues. And many of them are turning around now and saying, well, they're suing the clinics. They're suing the clinics and saying, you should have helped me. And some clinics are shutting down. The most notable one is in Britain. The largest, or maybe the only gender clinic there, the Tavistock, is now not doing medical intervention on minors. And it started with a detransitioner. A young woman who had detransitioned, I think she was 15. She was quite young. She had transitioned at age 15. She'd had a double mastectomy, hormones, the whole thing. And then I think she was about 19 or 20 when she detransitioned. And she took the clinic to court, to what they call the High Court, which is what in the US we call the Supreme Court. You have a Supreme Court? The highest court in the land. She went to the High Court, and she won. But on appeal, she lost. However, because of the first case where she won, people discovered what the clinic was doing. The judges were shocked. They had no idea that people were being transitioned at such young ages and without any counseling. And even the workers at the clinic went public criticizing the clinic, saying what we're doing here is not right. it's not good. We are not helping these young people. We're not giving them any sort of counseling. We're just fast-tracking them into transition. And so even the clinic workers came out publicly. And so the Tavistock Gender Clinic was shut down. So that's in Britain. And in the US, there are several cases making their way through the courts. And states are passing laws restricting medical interventions for minors, so puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery. Several European countries, in addition to England, are doing the same thing. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, France, Wales, Scotland, Germany, and the Netherlands have all passed laws restricting in some way medical intervention for minors. And saying, the medical evidence just wasn't there. Most of this was done based on a study that was done in the Netherlands, and so people are revisiting that study and saying, this isn't good. This isn't good science. We need to do better studies. So that's the good news. And last night I said, read the transitioners. They've been there. They're the ones who can speak from personal experience. And so when you find articles, or seek them out using Google, seek them out on the internet. And Chloe Cole, she's the most outspoken. She's appeared in Senate hearings and so on. Chloe Cole, C-O-L-E. She's the one I follow the most. And just Google Chloe Cole and you'll find some good stories. Okay, so that's strategy number 2. Strategy number 3, make allies. Many feminists oppose transgender ideology. After all, to protect women's rights, we must be able to say what a woman is. If sex is just a social construction, it becomes impossible to argue for rights based on the sheer fact of being biologically female. I've had some people push back and say, no, gender is a social construction, but not sex. No. The activists now say sex itself is a social construction. Judith Butler says sex itself is a social construction. And of course, we cannot legally protect a category of people if we cannot identify that category. And the feminists who are opposed to transgender ideology are often attacked in public by transgender activists, and they're called TERFs, T-E-R-F. That means trans exclusionary radical feminists. And it's intended as a slur. So if you see the word, so of course, feminists are proudly claiming it right now. Yes, we're TERFs. Trying to change the slur into a positive. So if you see the word TERF, that means the feminists who are against transgender ideology, because they realize it's erasing the category of women. And it is also allowing men into women's sports. And as you're following the news, you're seeing that more and more males are winning competitions in women's sports. It's allowing men into female prisons. Even sex offenders, if they claim to be a woman, they're now being allowed into women's prisons. There have been cases of men being moved into women's prisons and raping the prisoners. And so this is why it's in the news a lot these days because of that. And everything that the feminists warned about is happening. Now, I'm often asked on these issues, how do other people's choices affect you, right? Why not let them just live the way they want to? Well, the answer is that when laws are changed, that affects everyone. So I'm going to give you some examples that are from the US, but I hope you will see that the same underlying principles apply to other nations that are passing similar laws. The laws express a worldview. And so the same worldview is being imposed on other nations as well. The underlying principle is that a free society is possible only if it recognizes that some rights are pre-political. That means the state does not create them. The state merely recognizes them as pre-existing. They exist before the state exists. So it turns out that most of our pre-political rights are rooted in biology. And so if the law dismisses biology, we lose those rights. So take something like abortion. You know, I'm presuming you were here yesterday. I hope you were, because we covered these issues. And I'm going to be drawing on what I said yesterday. The right to life is the most fundamental of all, right? It's the right not to be killed. If you don't have that right, you don't have any other rights. And the state did not create that right. It's a right that you have just because you're a member of the human race. But the only way the state could legalize abortion was to rule that some humans are not legal persons. Right? Remember that yesterday? The secular bioethicists say the fetus is human, you know, from conception. I mean, genetics, DNA, just it's too strong to deny it. So the fetus is human, but it's not a person until sometime later. To be a person, you have to meet certain other criteria, mental abilities, cognitive functioning, and so on. But what does that mean? That means the state has claimed the authority to decide which humans qualify as persons with a right to live. Based on what? Well, obviously not based on biology, because they've admitted that biologically the fetus is human. So it must be based simply on arbitrary ruling by the state. The state decides which criteria qualify you as a person instead of as merely human. So this is a huge power grab by the state. It can decide now who you are no longer a person just because you're human. I mean, that's the principle. In principle, you are not a person unless the state recognizes you as a person. Marriage is a pre-political right. It's based on the fact that men and women naturally come together to form families. Humans are a sexually reproducing species, to speak like a biologist. But the only way the state can treat same-sex couples the same as opposite-sex couples is to deny the biological component of marriage and to redefine it as a purely emotional commitment. And that's what the US Supreme Court did in its Obergefell decision, which legalized same-sex marriage. What's the problem with that? The problem is we have lots of emotional commitments. So how do you know which ones qualify as marriage? Essentially, the state has claimed the authority to decide which ones. Which ones constitute a marriage? Based on what? Clearly not the facts of biology, but again, based on its own arbitrary decision, its own say-so. So again, that's a huge increase in state power. They can decide now whether you are married or not. Because it doesn't matter, the biological correspondence between male and female is not what defines marriage anymore. Okay, parenthood. Until now, who counts as a child's legal parents was based on biological relationship. The woman who gives birth is the mother, and her legal husband was presumed to be the child's biological parent, father. And this was called the presumption of parentage. But in same-sex couples, at least one parent, one partner, is not biologically related to the child. Until recently, therefore, at least in the US, that person's name did not go on the birth certificate. Even if even if a lesbian couple or a gay couple was living together, the non-biological partner was not considered a parent. They could adopt. And some same-sex parents would do that. They would adopt, but they argued that was not treating them exactly the same as opposite-sex parents, and therefore it was discrimination. And so in a 2017 decision, the Supreme Court agreed that was discrimination. If a couple is legally married, which, in a same-sex couple can be married, the non-biological same-sex spouse is given the presumption of parentage. In other words, what a married man and woman used to have, the husband was presumed to be the father. Now, in a same-sex couple, they have the presumption of parentage, which means a non-biological partner, spouse, now can be considered a parent. So parentage is being redefined without relationship to biology. So again, in principle, parenthood is now treated as something created by the state. You are your child's parent if the state says so. And finally, until recently, gender identity was thought to follow naturally, organically from your biological sex. People really did not make a distinction between being male and being masculine, being female and being feminine. But the only way the law can treat a transgender woman, which is someone born male, the same as a biological woman, was to say, biology is irrelevant. No, who cares about biology? And so, in a 2020 decision, the US Supreme Court ruled that sex in Title VII really means gender. So, in other words, the law no longer sees you as a man or a woman. It sees only what gender identity you claim. The law is not allowed to treat you as a biological male or female. The law is only allowed to treat you with the way your gender identity that you claim for yourself. So do you see the principle underlying all of these issues? Wherever you're, I'm not sure exactly where the law is here in Switzerland, but do you see how in all of these cases, many pre-political rights are rooted in biology. So when the law no longer recognizes biology, then the state claims the right to redefine all of these rights. So the sexual revolution is dramatically increasing the power of the state. Gender activists like to claim that gender ideology is just following the latest science. But no social practice is neutral. Every social practice rests on certain assumptions of what the world is like, on a worldview. And when a society accepts the practice, it absorbs the worldview that justifies it. And this is especially important when talking to young people. They think they're just following their feelings, right? That's all they really see is, I feel this, I feel that. We have to help them to see that they are really choosing between worldviews. That when they choose either a homosexual or transgender identity, they are essentially choosing a worldview that says your body doesn't matter. It's not part of your authentic self. They are choosing Camille Paglia's worldview, right? Yeah, their body is product of mindless, purposeless forces and has no intrinsic purpose. Let me end with a story. There was a girl who transitioned to male identity at age 14. And she writes, I read her blog, she wrote about it, and she said, all my friends on Tumblr were ecstatic. Here's how she puts it. The boy me was embraced and celebrated and affirmed much more than the girl me ever was. Right? You get here's how one. A mother that I interviewed once for an article on transgenderism, she said, these kids aren't vulnerable, marginalized kids. They get a parade. They come out as trans and they get a parade. Everyone celebrates them at school. Okay, by age 19, this same girl detransitioned and claimed her identity as a girl. She said, immediately, I lost all my friends. I was ostracized, I was shunned, I was ridiculed, I was attacked. So what does this detransitioner say is the solution to gender dysphoria? She writes, if I can convince even one girl to love her body for what it is, all the hostility I've experienced will be worth it. Now, she's not at all a Christian. Do you see what her blog is called? Lady Anti-Theist. She's not just an atheist, she's an anti-theist. So even non-Christians are recognizing that the key to overcoming gender ideology is to recognize the value of the body. So our message needs to start where the Bible starts, with Genesis, that God created the physical world, including our bodies, that He made us male and female, and He pronounced it very good. So thank you very much.